So in our last session, we looked at one of these verses that Jesus said that there are certain signs that must happen before he comes back, and that the gospel must be preached to all nations, then the end will come. And we saw that there are three possible interpretations. There are some people who interpret it as being past and it was completed in AD 70. There are some people who look at it as being in the present, that we need to preach to all nations and then Jesus will return. And there are some people who see that this is a verse for the future that will be fulfilled during the time of Great Tribulation. I guess each of us will probably come to our own view of which one of those we feel most comfortable with. But let us ask ourselves three questions that maybe help us to just unpack this a little bit further. The first question I want us to consider is, what do we understand by the phrase all nations? We already looked at the Greek word oikumene sort of meant the known world. And what do we understand? Is the Bible contradicting itself, where Paul writes in Colossians that the gospel's been preached to all nations? Or we look in Acts where Jews from every nation under heaven are present at the day of Pentecost. Is the Bible contradicting itself? When you read verses like in Revelation 5, where there's people from every nation under heaven. How do we understand that? Is it meant to be something that we understand figuratively? I suppose one way to understand it is that the vernacular of the day, when it talks about the ends of the earth or all nations, is a bit like saying it's being preached all over the place. And some people would actually approach that verse as it's sort of written in the vernacular. The gospel will be preached all over the place before Jesus comes back. But also, what do we understand? Is it symbolic? What do we understand by nations? Do we mean every ethnic group, every sort of tribe within a nation? Do we understand it geographically? Or do we understand that actually, if you've preached in the capital of South Korea, you've preached to every nation, even if you haven't preached to every people group? I think how we understand that verse might actually make a difference as to how we understand what Jesus meant. The second question I want us to consider is, what do we really mean by then the end will come? Matthew regularly teaches throughout his book. He often talks about the end of the age. It's one of Matthew's themes that goes through his gospel. And what he means by that is something which is open to debate. When he talks about the end of the age, is he talking about the old covenant, the covenant of the Old Testament that was fulfilled by Jesus coming? Or do we understand the end of the age to mean when Jesus returns? Certainly, if we understand this verse about the end will come when the gospel's been preached as being the time when Jesus returns, that can have implications for how we understand some of the last things. Do we understand that actually, if we're talking about the end of the age, it's sort of the end of the church age and the beginning of tribulation? How we choose to understand that sense of the end of the age will again influence how we approach this verse. The third question that this verse sort of causes us to question is really, what happens if people die without hearing the gospel? I think as Christians we have to understand that God is fair and just, and that he will judge everybody according to their deeds. But when we read verses like in Romans 1 and verse 20, we read passages like, since the beginning of the world, God's invisible qualities have been revealed, so that man is without excuse. There is a sense that when we look at the world, we can see God. Personally, it's one of the reasons, one of the explanations I have for why there are so many religions in the world. Because clearly within the heart of man is God's placed eternity. And when we look at creation, we can clearly see that there must be a God out there. But without a language or something to define, to interpret that, it's very hard to understand. And right back at the beginning of Bite Size Bible, we looked at the idea of God revealing himself. That the world can look at creation and see the existence of a creator. But for us to understand that creator, he has to reveal himself. And as Christians, that's how we approach God. We understand that he's revealed himself in the person of Jesus. We need to do all that we can to share the gospel, but we also need to recognise that God is fair and just, and that he has created a world that it is possible for people to recognise who he is, whether or not we've actually managed to preach the gospel to them. I've presented with this verse 3 possible interpretations of it and 3 questions that cause us to unpack it a little bit further. And some of what I've said you might be disagreeing with me on. That's fine. I'd have no problem with that whatsoever. And I would encourage you to understand and get your own understanding, a biblical understanding of how you approach this. Maybe you disagree with some of the things I've said, but actually we need to have a response that recognises that when Jesus returns, all nations will have heard about the gospel. We maybe don't know how exactly that will happen. We don't know maybe exactly what form that will take. And we have to remember that God's heart is a compassionate heart, that it beats with this dual pump, pump, pump. None should perish, all should be saved. None should perish, all should be saved. God's heart is beating with grace, compassion and mercy, longing for people to come to saving faith. And that's one of the reasons I believe that the end has not happened yet, is because God is hungry for and passionate for people to come to saving faith. But when we approach this verse, we don't know exactly how it will be fulfilled, but we have to believe and accept that it will be fulfilled. And we have to leave the possibility open that it may have already been fulfilled, and consequently Jesus might be able to return at any time.